Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. A teacher drives west for a quiet weekend in Carlsbad. By noon the next day, her essentials are still on a hotel nightstand, and she is gone. In desert towns, silence spreads fast. Within days, officers are searching ranch land outside the city limits. What began as a couple's argument is now a crime that forces a single question: who was with her, when, and why? We begin where the record starts to tighten. Saturday, March 1st, 2014, around 11:30 p.m., inside the Blue Cactus Lounge at the Stevens Inn. Emily Lambert, 30, is on a weekend visit from Texas. Witnesses later describe an argument, short, public, and noticed. The details matter because in cases like this, timing becomes evidence. Staff remember closing duties. Patrons recall the usual shuffle toward the lobby and parking lot. In that narrow window, Emily is last clearly accounted for. The first inconsistency appears not in what people say, but in what Emily leaves behind. In the room she booked, her phone and wallet remain on the nightstand. That's a negative digital indicator. The device doesn't move because it isn't with her. For investigators, that absence matters as much as any GPS ping ever could. No phone means no call, no text, and no subsequent location trail tied to her. It also means any story that claims she walked off with someone has to explain why her essentials stayed put. Sunday, March 2nd, around noon, the boyfriend places a call to 911. He reports that Emily left the hotel with another man and didn't return. Dispatch logs the claim. Units respond. Patrol's first job is not to debate motives. It's to set a clock and build the outer edges of a search box. Officers confirm the room details, tag the unattended personal effects, and request staff lists for brief interviews. The scope spreads from the lounge to the parking lots, then out to South Canal Street's arteries that feed drivers toward the edge of town. The standard broadcast, "Be on the lookout," goes out with a concise description and last seen location. Here the case adopts the structure you'll hear across most solvable disappearances: fix the timeline, protect the scene, preserve the statements. Patrol checks CCTV coverage zones around the inn and along the immediate egress routes. Desk staff identify who checked in, who checked out, and when. Any missing key cards are noted. Officers isolate the room long enough for evidence techs to do a first-pass inventory: what's there, what's not, and what might carry trace. The aim is to keep contamination low and documentation high. Emotions are not the metric. Chain of custody is. It's important to understand what doesn't happen in this phase. There is no dramatic dive into speculation, no leap to motive, and no creative theories presented to the public. The first day is about verifiable anchors, timestamps, objects left, witnesses who can be recontacted, and any camera frames that show who crossed which threshold. The officers aren't writing a story, they're building a spine that later parts of the file must match. Within hours, the first set of interviews adds clarity. Staff confirm the argument and the general direction of movement after closing. No one independently corroborates the claim that Emily left with another man. That absence doesn't prove a crime, but it does warn investigators to separate what is heard from what is recorded. One detective phrases it the way many do off camera: the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. When a narrative presents itself fully formed before the evidence arrives, you hold it at arm's length and work the record. The search posture expands methodically. Patrol units drive predictable corridors out of Carlsbad, roads commonly used to leave late at night. Supervisors prioritize quick wins: lobby cams, exterior cams, neighboring businesses open late. If a vehicle left the lot in a time window that lines up with witness recollections, that footage will matter. If nothing shows, that absence becomes its own kind of note, pushing investigators to widen the ring. As the first day closes, the file contains 3 anchors that will survive legal scrutiny. 1. A documented argument at a specific place and time. 2. A negative digital fact: Emily's phone is stationary at the inn after the bar closes. 3. A report to 911 that asserts a departure with another man, unsupported by staff or camera confirmation. Together, they narrow the investigative lens. This is how a missing person call shifts, not by emotion, but by conflicts between claims and verifiable events. A quick word on tone and approach. In towns like Carlsbad, homicides aren't just crimes. They strain the fabric of a community that relies on predictability, Same roads, same faces, same closing times. That's why investigators avoid grandstanding early. If the file is to hold, it must be coherent from minute one. What you'll hear next won't rehash what you've already heard. Each part adds a new layer. Injury mechanics, trace in a vehicle, carrier records where 2014 technology allows. No loops, no filler. The clock is set, the room is documented. To understand harm, you move from timeline to injuries, the part of the case where the decedent becomes a second scene. The file moves off the timeline and into the lab. Intake is conducted under bright, even light. The decedent is assigned a case number, barcoded tags, and photographed in a 4-quadrant sequence. Each step is logged against time and personnel. The language is clinical for a reason. What happens here must stand up later, without embellishment. Property is documented first. Clothing, jewelry, and trace retentive items are removed, sealed, and signed across the tape. Fingernail scrapings and clippings are collected into sterile envelopes. Hair combings are taken for possible foreign fibers. Buccal swabs are reserved for reference DNA, with chain of custody lines pre-printed and signed in ink. The pathologist confirms identifiers against release paperwork. A second tech verifies. Small redundancies prevent big mistakes. External examination records injuries without interpretation. Linear abrasions track along areas consistent with ground contact. There are patterned impacts on the head and face, blunt force injuries described by contour and size, not by guesswork. Around the neck, there is ligature marking compatible with rope or cordage. Each mark is mapped with a scale and rephotographed at oblique angle to capture depth. When the term consistent with appears in an autopsy, it is not an accusation. It is a statistical statement about how an injury tends to look when produced by a certain mechanism. Clothing is triaged for trace. Soil adhered to fabric is lifted for comparison to rural substrates. If there are microtransfers, fibers, small vegetal fragments, they are captured on tape lifts and preserved. The lab request will later ask for comparative analysis against samples taken from a vehicle's undercarriage, wheel wells, or rope fibers if recovered. The morgue does not test that here. It preserves the capacity to test it well. The internal examination proceeds by standard order. Skull fractures and intracranial findings are documented by location and dimension. Hemorrhages are described in layers to clarify whether trauma occurred before or after death. The presence of neck hemorrhage beneath ligature marks is significant because it suggests force applied while circulation still functioned. The report does not leap to cause and manner. It builds the elements that will support those conclusions later. Time of death windowing is approached conservatively. Core temperature, ambient conditions, clothing, and body habitus are considered. Lividity distribution and fixation are recorded. Rigor stage is noted. Nothing precise is promised. A bracket is given that aligns with last known alive data and the first report of concern. In cases like this, it's not a single number, but an overlap of ranges that matters. When those ranges line up with a tight external timeline, it adds weight without theatrics. Toxicology samples, blood, vitreous, urine, are pulled before any fixatives are introduced. The laboratory request covers common volatiles, therapeutic drugs, and illicit substances. Results in homicide files are often less about a narrative of behavior and more about confounders. Was the victim incapacitated? Would a drug make certain injuries more or less likely? The answers refine, not replace, the injury analysis. Photographs are repeated after washing. True color is maintained with calibration cards. Any residual staining is documented for pattern only. Absent a lab report, it remains descriptive, not conclusory. Swabs for potential biological material are collected from areas of interest and sealed. The chain of custody sheet grows longer. Who collected, when, for what purpose, with which seal numbers. The most powerful chart in a courtroom is sometimes not a photo, but a clean custody log with no gaps. The findings align with what investigators expect to test outside the lab. Patterned blunt force trauma is compatible with an object like a portable air pump, an item that exists in many vehicles and garages. Ligature evidence supports a hypothesis of restraint or dragging. Abrasions and substrate residues suggest movement across ground, not just placement. Those points, stated clinically, will later be matched or rejected against statements and physical items recovered elsewhere. The morgue does not prove a route. It proves a mechanism. One line from the lead detective after observing the documentation session captures the posture going forward. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. When injuries, statements, and potential tools start to echo each other, investigators slow down. They verify with lab work rather than cadence. The aim is a file that survives cross-examination, not a story that sounds persuasive on the first listen. There is a human layer even here. Professionals working this scene do not narrate grief, but they act to prevent secondary harm, misidentification, evidence loss, speculative leaks. In towns like Carlsbad, murders aren't just crimes. They pull at the quiet threads that hold people together. Precision is a form of respect for the victim, for the process, and for the truth that will be asked of a jury. The chapter closes with what is preliminary and what is confirmed. Preliminary, soil and fiber comparisons pending, full toxicology pending, toolmark congruence pending. Confirmed, multiple blunt force impacts, ligature-associated neck injury, abrasion patterns compatible with surface drag, a time of death bracket consistent with the external timeline established earlier. No more, no less. Injuries imply transport. Transport implies a conveyance. The next step is to examine the places and objects that could carry that trace, the room and the ride. The room at the Stevens Inn is sealed and photographed before anyone touches a drawer. It looks ordinary until you read it like a scene. Personal effects on the nightstand, no forced entry on the latch or frame, no sign of rummaging. A tech runs a flashlight at oblique angles across the carpet and bedspread to catch transfer that would vanish in overhead light. Items are logged in a single direction of travel, from the door inward, so custody later reads clean. Swabs are taken from high contact points, interior door handle, bathroom faucet, phone case, remote control. Linens are bundled and sealed. The mattress seam is vacuumed for trace and the contents captured on sterile filters for later fiber comparison. The sink trap is removed and packaged. It's one of the cheapest ways to preserve wash-off trace without guessing which substance to prioritize. Nothing in this pass answers the question of where Emily went. It narrows who can credibly say what happened before she left the line of sight. On the lot outside, the vehicle linked to the reporting party is towed under warrant. It is processed in a bay where the floor has already been cleaned and tested negative for background. An undercarriage exam comes first. Wheel wells and suspension arms are swabbed. Soil is scraped from protected recesses. A small roll of rope found in the cargo area is packaged. A portable air pump is boxed after photographs show repeated surface wear. Both are routine objects in New Mexico. Neither is sensationalized in the log. The only question that matters is fit. Does fiber, soil, or tool mark evidence align with what the morgue documented? Inside the cabin, a particulate lift is done from the footwells and cargo floor. Tape lifts capture fibers and small vegetal fragments. Each lift card is labeled to the square inch. Seats and seat belts are UV scanned and swabbed where appropriate. Any biological collection is done without comment about meaning until a lab report supports it. The steering wheel and gear shift are processed for latent prints only after the trace work is complete. Cross-contamination between sections is avoided by changing gloves even when it seems redundant. Redundancy is the whole point. Cameras answer what the room and car imply. The hotel's exterior dome camera is pulled for the last hour before closing through the early morning. Staff provide a rough schedule of when the lot tends to be busiest. Techs bookmark departures that match the time frame established earlier. Two neighboring businesses maintain storefront cameras angled toward South Canal Street. Frames that capture a similar vehicle are flagged and time-stamped. If the plate is not readable, the egress direction still matters. In a town built around predictable corridors, direction can be as probative as identity. Every item is classified by status as the catalog closes for the day. Rope fibers, working until a comparison microscope says otherwise. Soil from the undercarriage, working until mineral content and granulometry are matched to a known source. Portable air pump, working until toolmark impressions or impact patterning line up with injury geometry the pathologist recorded. Linens and vacuum trace, working until the lab says whether those fibers belong to common hotel stock or something introduced. The first confirmations are procedural, not dramatic. There is no forced entry to the room. The keycard log reflects normal use for a shared room. The lot camera confirms the general flow of departures. Nothing contradicts the window already on paper. The car shows typical dusting for a vehicle that drives out of town at night, but the protected recesses under the body carry more specific soil that lab work can resolve. None of this proves a route. It proves a direction for testing. And a detective notes something that becomes a quiet rule for the rest of the file. If an object is common, you treat it as common until the science says unique. Air pumps and rope don't convict anyone on their own. What matters is whether their microscopic signatures travel with the victim's injuries and the ground where she was eventually found. You will not hear claims in this narration that outrun the lab. That restraint keeps the story from splitting into two narratives, one emotional, one evidentiary. There is a human piece even in this sterile work. Text moves slow because families deserve a file that will not collapse under pressure months or years later. In towns like Carlsbad, murders don't just register as statistics, they alter routines, the way people look at a parking lot camera, the way they lock a hotel door. Precision is how you quiet rumors without ever holding a press conference. By the end of this scene cycle, the next steps are clear. Compare rope fiber to any ligature trace. Compare undercarriage soil to the rural substrate documented at recovery. Compare any tool marks or impact profiles on the air pump to injury contours. Cross-check egress frames with carrier records in the next phase. Each confirmation will either support the timeline already built or force it to bend. Movement is tested next, not with apps or live location pings, but with what existed in 2014, carrier records and fixed cameras. Investigators submit preservation letters to the phone company covering the hours, bracketing the blue cactus closing and the midday 911 report. The goal is simple: tower hits, sector directions, and call less SMS metadata for the reporting party. Emily's device remains irrelevant to routing because it stayed in the room. That fact is already logged and does not change. The question now is whether any phone that mattered moved along the same corridors the cameras suggest. Call detail records arrive in the format every detective learns to read: timestamps, originating terminating numbers, cell site IDs, and azimuth sectors. A map analyst overlays the sites used between late night and the early morning quiet. The first tower pairings ring true for Carlsbad, downtown coverage near South Canal Street, then a hop to a site that services the south and southeast edge. Sector orientation matters. A face of a panel pointing southeast can't guarantee a road, but it can make some routes improbable. That's how the net tightens without claiming GPS precision that doesn't exist. Parallel to the carrier work, the camera pulls from the hotel, and neighboring storefronts are stitched into a beat-by-beat timeline. One outbound vehicle matching the make and class linked to the reporting party appears in the last frames before the lot quiets. The plate isn't legible, but the direction is. The vehicle exits toward South Canal. A separate storefront camera farther down the corridor catches a similar silhouette minutes later. It's not proof of identity, it's a path to test against tower sectors. Two intervals stand out in the carrier data. One is an expected lull when the phone registers no calls or texts for roughly an hour. Idle periods can mean a powered device sitting still, a powered device in a coverage gap, or a powered device in motion without transactions. Analysts treat it conservatively and look to the site refreshes for passive hints. The record shows a site handoff that aligns with a southeast vector. The second interval is shorter, just long enough for a device to sit in a mapped sector without hopping. That could imply a pause on a roadside or a parked location within that sector's reach. No one in the room calls it a stop. They mark it as a possible dwell for later groundwork. A detective folds the CDR map over a road atlas and traces the corridor that locals know. South Canal feeds toward Potash Mines Road and County Road 31, the approach to open land near Loving. Cameras get sparse out there, which is why the sector orientations matter. A tower that throws a 120-degree slice across those roads can't prove a car's position, but it can undermine any statement that claims a northbound detour or a return to a different part of town. The narrative must bend to physics. That's the value of 2014-era signals. They are limited and reliable at the same time. Messaging content isn't the point, metadata is. The records show ordinary traffic before the argument hour and a communications dip afterward. The first activity that lights back up is the 911 call near midday from within Carlsbad's core coverage, matching what dispatch already logged. Investigators take no victory laps about alignment. One of them notes, again, a rule that keeps the file from drifting. When the data lines up neatly, verify it twice. So they do. A short list of follow-ups leaves no guesswork. Field teams will physically drive the corridor at comparable hours to check how phones in test vehicles register site changes in real space. That's not theatrics, it's routine validation for later testimony. A second request goes to the carrier for sector maps current to 2014, not modernized overlays that can mislead a jury about range. Finally, analysts set a side-by-side, camera timestamps in one column, tower hits in the next. Where both columns move together, confidence increases. Where they don't, the plan is to find out why, not to force a fit. There is a practical human reason for this pace. Families deserve conclusions built on verifiable movement, not on repeated claims. In towns like Carlsbad, the roads are familiar. It's easy to assume a route. The work here avoids assumption. If the vehicle linked to the reporting party traveled out of the hotel lot toward the southeast corridor in the hours when Emily could not call or text, that is a fact pattern a jury can understand without technical gloss. By closing time on this phase, the movement picture has edges. Outbound direction is supported by 2 camera points and sector orientations that agree. A dark interval invites testing, not storytelling. No one declares a destination. The next steps are to run interviews and recorded statements against this spine, note the mismatches, and see which version of events survives the friction. Detectives moved quickly to gather statements from bar staff, hotel workers, and patrons. Everyone confirmed the late-night argument, but no one could back the claim that Emily Lambert left with another man. That key phrase, first heard on the 911 call, stood alone without corroboration. Hotel staff verified her phone and wallet left on the nightstand. Keycard records showed routine use tied only to shared occupancy with no anomalies or outside entries. Maintenance logs supported that nothing unusual had occurred with the locks. When the reporting party gave his version, small shifts appeared. First he said she walked out calmly. Later he added a directional note that conflicted with camera pulls in carrier sectors already mapped. Investigators marked these as discrepancies, not proof, yet patterns were forming. A linguistics review of the 911 tape noted distancing language, signaling areas where claims should face hard records. At the same time, patrons described Emily as upset but not impaired, reinforcing that leaving essentials behind was unusual. Toxicology would later test this further. By the close of this phase, investigators documented 3 firm points. No witness saw Emily depart with a stranger, directional claims clashed with digital records, and keycard use fit only known occupants. Each was logged for court, measured and sourced. With movement and statements mapped, investigators shift to what can be bought, carried, or staged. The aim is narrow. Determine whether the rope and portable air pump logged in the vehicle were long-standing items or freshly obtained around the March 2 window. This isn't about narrative. It's about provenance and timing against the medical examiner's time of death bracket. Financial subpoenas go out for card activity tied to the reporting party, hotel folio, bar tab, nearby fuel purchases, and any discount card lookups at big box or auto stores that weekend. Cash leaves fewer footprints, so detectives pair the paper trail with surveillance pulls from gas stations and convenience stores along South Canal and the Southeast Corridor. Clerks provide register Z tapes and time-stamped receipts where the system retains them. Each candidate transaction is compared to carrier sector hits to see whether the phone linked to the reporting party could plausibly have been present. Inside the crime lab, the rope is logged for diameter, twist, and composition. A fiber analyst cuts representative strands and mounts them for comparison microscopy. If the rope shows factory fray consistent with new purchase, that's noted. If it carries embedded soils or oxidized wear typical of trunk tools, that's noted too. The portable air pump is photographed, swabbed, and then cast for any distinctive edges that could leave injury-consistent impressions. Toolmark work proceeds slowly. Compatibility with the injury pattern remains working until the lab signs off. Nothing in this chapter changes that status by assumption. Investigators collect background samples from the hotel room linens and the vehicle's interior to avoid false association. If a hardware store visit appears on a receipt near closing time, the lab still has to show that the rope from the cargo area and any ligature trace share the same fiber profile. If no such receipt exists, the question becomes whether the rope is a generic trunk item that predated the weekend. Either outcome is legally useful. A recent purchase can support planning. A pre-existing tool can still support opportunity and means. At the same time, fuel stops are measured against the movement spine. A late-night fill-up south of the hotel, if found, would place the vehicle on the outbound vector when the cameras in tower sectors already suggest the same direction. A lack of fuel stops can be equally informative. Some corridors require little gas for a short, out-and-back trip. Investigators run the vehicle's approximate MPG and tank level from prior charges to see if the trip could happen without a purchase. That prevents overclaiming a missing receipt as proof of anything. A small but important collection step follows. Footwear impressions from the reporting party, gathered with consent or warrant, and tire-size model documentation from the towed vehicle. Yet these aren't for the morgue. They belong to the ground where the body was recovered. If substrate comparisons show mineral content on the undercarriage that matches the rural lot near Loving, and if tire characteristics align with impressions documented there, the corridor gains independent strength. Again, working until lab confirmation. Back at the hotel, the folio shows ordinary charges, room, bar, taxes. No surprise there. Detectives pay attention to timestamps that bracket the argument and any charges that could indicate brief departures. Where surveillance fills gaps, an exterior camera at a 24-hour store showing a figure at a register, analysts match clothing or posture to earlier hotel footage. Identification is cautious. In 2014 quality video, clarity varies. The gain comes from synchronized clocks, register time aligned with the carrier timestamp tied to the same sector. Prosecutors consult early to keep the scope conservative. If the rope appears pre-existing and the pump is a common trunk tool, the planning theory narrows to what happened after the argument rather than days of preparation. That still supports intent if the injuries indicate focused force and the movement record shows transport to conceal. If, however, a receipt surfaces for rope or related materials purchased between the lounge closing and the 911 call, that pushes the analysis toward rapid procurement. Either way, the timeline tightens without spectacle. There's a human layer to this work too, even if the tone stays professional. Families don't need adjectives, they need accuracy. In towns like Carlsbad, people remember who was seen at which counter and when. Memory informally guides the camera pulls, but it's the stamped paper and lab reports that will be asked to carry weight in court. The file protects that difference. Recollection suggests, records decide. By the end of this phase, the evidence lanes are ready to merge. Rope and pump provenance classified, pre-existing versus recent fuel and store visits mapped against tower sectors, and lab requests filed for fiber, soil, and possible tool mark correlation to the injury geometry documented earlier. Charges become viable when procurement, movement, and mechanism point the same way at the same time. With evidence collected, investigators and prosecutors now focus on proving charges. Detectives and the 5th Judicial District Attorney map the timeline, injury findings, and digital records directly to statutory elements. Warrants are drawn narrowly, vehicle, hotel room, carrier records, to secure admissibility later. Interagency roles are clear. Carlsbad PD leads, New Mexico State Police Crime Lab handles forensic work, and Eddy County supports field operations. The charging memo lists facts already confirmed. The late-night argument at the Blue Cactus Lounge, belongings left at the Stevens Inn, outbound movement toward South Canal, and injuries documented at autopsy. These align with first-degree murder, supported by either deliberate action or felony murder through restraint and transport. A companion tampering charge is held in reserve where evidence shows concealment. Arrest is timed to paperwork, not press. Statements after Miranda are logged and tested against carrier records and cameras. Inconsistencies are flagged immediately. Grand jury practice remains streamlined. Timeline, autopsy, lab status. Discoveries handled tightly. Contradictions produced, gaps cataloged, and raw records supplied to avoid suppression claims. The strategy is restraint. The file tells one consistent story with every element backed by an independent line of proof. The goal is not drama, but durability in court, admissibility in motions, the evidence the jury will and will not hear. The file moves from the squad room to the courtroom with one aim: show the jury what survives scrutiny. Pretrial hearings are handled first. The judge admits the hotel and storefront camera clips, the carrier sector maps limited to their 2014 ranges, the autopsy findings with measured language, and the 911 recording for context. Motions to suppress are denied where the search warrants are narrow and supported by sworn affidavits. Miranda compliance is found sufficient. The rope and portable pump are allowed with careful instructions. Comparisons may be discussed, certainty may not be overstated. Bail is denied based on the seriousness of the crime and the movement evidence indicating a risk of flight from supervision. Jury selection turns on two questions. Can panelists weigh sector mapping without expecting GPS? And can they consider injuries without speculation? Once seated, they hear a lean story told in layers rather than repeats. The state starts where this record is strongest: time. A detective testifies to closing time at the lounge, the corridor out of the Stevens Inn lot, and the timestamps that lock those frames in sequence. He's not permitted to draw conclusions that go beyond the data. He doesn't need to. Two cameras and carrier sectors already point the same direction. The medical investigator follows. She explains patterned blunt force injuries to the head, ligature-associated neck trauma consistent with restraint, and drag-compatible abrasions. Importantly, she draws the line at mechanism certainty. Where the toolmark comparison is still working, she says so. Where features are confirmed, the presence of hemorrhage indicating force applied while alive, she says that too. The jury is given cause, not theatrics. A forensic analyst introduces the carrier records, timestamps, tower IDs, sector azimuths. He sketches what those slices of coverage do and do not mean. They cannot place a car on a specific lane. They can exclude a sudden detour in another direction within the same minute window. When the defense probes how precise, the analyst repeats the range and acknowledges limits. It reads as credibility, not weakness. The point is not to claim GPS, it's to show the movement spine holds when tested. Hotel staff and patrons supply the human edges. They confirm the argument and the end-of-night flow. None can place Emily leaving with an unknown man. That 911 claim stands alone without a second witness or a camera frame to support it. On cross, the defense suggests memory gaps. On redirect, the state anchors testimony to clocks and receipts, not impressions. The jury hears that Emily's essentials were left in her room, a fact logged once and treated as a logistical anchor rather than a source of drama. The defense case centers on common object arguments and sector uncertainty. Counsel notes that rope and pumps are ordinary items. The lab, he says, cannot prove a unique source. He suggests the carrier sectors could be bleed from a tower with broad coverage. The state's answer is discipline, not volume. The analyst repeats the face of the sector and the two independent cameras that agree on outbound direction. The lab tech confirms that while the rope is not one of a kind, its fiber profile and twist match the ligature trace and class characteristics. No single exhibit is asked to carry intent. Intent is built across conduct, injuries, and transport. Closing arguments are as narrow as the file that produced them. Prosecutors do not promise a perfect map or a magical tool mark. They offer a record that stayed inside its lanes: the argument, the essentials left behind, the outbound corridor documented by two lenses and a set of sectors, injuries that speak to deliberate, focused force, statements that shift when stacked against physical movement, and post-incident conduct that points away from a spontaneous walk-off. Separate lines of proof, one conclusion. The phrase is careful by design. The jury deliberates without hearing any retelling of discovery or redundant narrative. When they return, the foreperson speaks for them, guilty of first-degree murder. Sentencing follows state law. The court imposes life imprisonment. There is no split ending to confuse viewers or families. The judge explains rights of appeal and the record moves up. On appeal, lawyers argue what trial courts are built to withstand: admissibility boundaries, sector reliability, evidentiary weight. The New Mexico Supreme Court reviews the conviction and affirms it in 2016. The opinion, summarized in contemporaneous reporting and court filings, leaves the verdict intact. For Emily Lambert's family and community, that affirmance matters. It is not a new story. It is confirmation that the original story was told with discipline. There is space here for one line that is not legal. In places like Carlsbad, people know the roads and the faces that travel them. A well-built homicide file respects that. It does not add flourish where facts are enough. It protects the difference between rumor and record, between fear and proof. That's not just procedure. It's how communities hold together after a violent loss. When a crime is proven this way, cleanly, with limits acknowledged, the verdict does more than punish. It tells the truth once. This concludes the courtroom phase. The evidentiary spine you've followed, Time, movement, injuries, statements remains the record of what happened and why the law answered as it did. Telling Emily Lambert's story is never easy, but it reminds us that behind every statistic is a life, a family, and a community forever changed. In America, we often talk about justice as something that happens in court, but justice also means learning from tragedy before it repeats. Violence that starts with control or anger can end with loss beyond repair. As you reflect on this crime, what do you think communities can do to intervene earlier to protect those at risk? Share your perspective in the comments. Your thoughts might help someone else. And if this story moved you or made you stop and think, please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next case we uncover together.